In this study, we're looking at an enemy coalition, forces ranged against the Lord. 3 incidents covered in Mark 5:21 through to chapter 6, verse 6. If you'd like to read that passage first, and then we'll look at it. So there are 3 incidents here: the raising of Jairus' daughter, Jesus' surprise at his having healed the woman with the hemorrhage, and his comparative impotence in Nazareth. We shall also take the occasional backward look to the story of Legion, which we studied last time. In these incidents, we're looking for something of the dynamics of the power encounter between the Lord and a powerful enemy coalition. I want to describe that coalition in terms that are not entirely straight out of the Bible. And the first element that I want to pick out is the finite nature of life in this world and of human life in this world in particular. Some of the simplest things you might think of, we simply cannot do. Take a mathematical example. Think of the numbers between 0 and 1. There are infinitely many of them. The way that mathematicians cope with that infinity is to say that if you think you've got a complete list of all the numbers between 0 and 1, which would of course be a finite list, then, well, I can find a number that I can add to it to prove that your list was not complete. That is, no finite list of those numbers could be complete. There are always more numbers to be added. There are infinitely many of them. One of the ways in which I try to impress that on students is to say that you can't write down a list of all the numbers between 0 and 1 because there simply isn't time. To write down infinitely many numbers, you'd need infinitely much time. And the whole point of our human condition is that we don't have that much time at our disposal. We are finite. When I was just a little lad, I liked playing with my dinky toys, but I tended to play with them one at a time, because when I attempted to play with them several at a time, trying to simulate a real-life situation with a bit of a road layout, I needed to make it so that they would each be moving around independently of each other. And I became frustrated because I couldn't produce the required several centres of decision and control to make several cars move independently at the same time. I was experiencing the finiteness of our human condition. I was discovering what we can't do because we're finite. Or at least I was dipping my toes in that experience. When I was a student, before I became convinced that there was such a thing as the devil, I had a very good shot at explaining the whole problem of our human condition in terms of that finiteness. Our ability, for instance, to cope with moral decisions is limited by the finite quantity and limited quality of the information we can gather, as well as by the limited nature of our own view of that data. That was the sort of line I worked on, anyway. Well, the fact is that I later became convinced that such features did not account for the entire problem, that they did picture a significant part of it. So that's the first element of this enemy coalition that's ranged against us, our finite nature. The second element in this coalition is the mortal condition of mankind. However impressed you are by the complexity of a human person, one thing of which you're certain is that that person will die. In fact, that death isn't so much of an event as a process, they tell us, which gets well underway in a healthy person by the time they're about 25. This inevitable decay, then, isn't just a feature of human life either. It's a property of the universe as a whole. The second law of thermodynamics has it that entropy is always increasing. That sounds totally unintelligible. It means that the level of organisation of the atoms and molecules in the universe is always going down, at least if you average it out over the entire universe. Change and decay in all around IC is built into the laws of physics. I came across some reflections on this, which I wrote down just after the funeral of Princess Diana some years ago. Our lives then had been totally dominated by an attack upon us by death, one member of this enemy coalition. The funeral itself made me sad, not so much because of what was in it, as because of what was left out of it. It seemed to me that the service failed to help people face the awful onslaught of death, the utter offensiveness of death, and failed to let them be addressed by the good news of Jesus and his resurrection, that there is a way through and only that one way. I find it highly offensive that when the machinery inside that young woman's chest suffered an accident, that brought about the end of Diana as a person. We all feel that there's so much more to a human being than the mechanical functionings of the bits inside their chests or inside their heads, indeed. It's an insult to our feelings of what human life is about that mechanical failure like that could stop such a young lady existing as a person. It's desperately offensive. It constitutes an attack on humanity by an enemy of humanity. So the second element of the enemy coalition we're looking at here is our mortal nature. The third one then is disease. One of the people who taught me the philosophy of religion had a favourite expression saying that God has given the universe a relative independence of him. You can't say that the universe is completely independent of God because the Bible claims that God is Lord over all, but you do find things happening in the universe which seem to be going on quite independently of what you understand God would want to be happening. You get, for instance, the mutating of an organism over many generations, ending up by becoming the virus which causes COVID-19. Those generations of viruses were free to change and to become that particular coronavirus. They had the independence to do so. I don't believe that God ever sat down and decided to create that coronavirus, but I do believe that he's decided to take the risk of allowing that sort of measure of independence to the physical world so that those processes can happen. Disease, whether it's caused by viruses or bacteria or brought about by a mutation in the person's own genes, it would appear to result largely from this relative independence. The fourth member of the enemy coalition is sin. When you take that relative independence into the area of human decision-making, you have the awful fact that the Lord has allowed us the possibility of making decisions which take our lives away from what he wants. We have the possibility of making such decisions as will create a gulf between ourselves and the Lord. And that possibility is graphically described in the story of the Garden of Eden, and it's echoed on most of the remaining pages of the Bible. Last, fifthly, in this coalition is the devil and all his forces. We've had examples of evil spirits holding individual people in thrall and of Jesus releasing people from their clutches. Last time we had something which seemed on a larger scale than that Jesus went into a territory he'd not visited before and was greeted by a man suffering from a major infestation of spirits, allegedly thousands of them. I've actually heard it claimed that the evil spirit presence in that man was on that high level because he was the devil's centre of operations in that territory. Paul later mentions things like this under the title of principalities and powers, different high levels of responsibility in the devil's command structure. It may well be that that was what we were seeing in Legion. And as Jesus goes into a new territory, so the spirits who reckon they control that territory inevitably come out to meet him and challenge him. And of course, praise God, Jesus wins. So we've got this enemy coalition, a coalition which has more traditionally been referred to as the world, the flesh, and the devil. It's an enemy of God in that it's tending to thwart and destroy what God is up to. I said at the outset that what we have in today's reading is an insight into the dynamics of the power encounter between Jesus and this coalition. Let's look at those dynamics. First of all, the finite nature of our life in this world is positively countered by the very event of the incarnation. The presence of God himself in human form as a part of the finite creation provides the best ever bridge between our life in this finite world and the world of the infinite. We have at last the means of access into the world of the infinite. We can be in touch with something which is otherwise totally beyond our grasp. Secondly, the mortal nature of our life in this world is countered by the resurrection. The presence of the resurrection of Jesus as an event in the human scene, happening to a member of the human race, is a major signal that death, once considered a full stop to human affairs, may be more of a semicolon, shall we say, something where the flow holds back for a moment but can continue afterwards. In our story today, this resurrection is pre-echoed if you like, by what happens to Jairus' daughter. Jesus raised her to life in the sense that he returned her to her mortal life. She would again die, of course, in her time. So it's not the same thing as the resurrection of Jesus, but it's a very strong pre-echo of it. And the power of this event is witnessed by the reticence with which Jesus entered into it. He would only take a small inner group of disciples with him, and he gave strict instructions that they weren't to blab about this to everyone. It was the sort of event that could blow the world clean apart, and Jesus knew it wasn't time for that sort of explosive happening just then. I want to move to the fifth element of the coalition next, and then come back to the others. The fifth one, you'll recall, was the devil. I think we've already adequately covered the way that Jesus countered this enemy, giving a clear word of command to evil spirits who obviously recognized a word which came from higher up the spiritual pecking order than they were themselves. So let's take next the fourth element in my list, sin. One of the gospel incidents I'd like to draw in as evidence here is in fact in John's gospel and not in Mark. In fact, most people assume it isn't really in John, but it's in the pages of John that it's been preserved. This, of course, I'm referring to the story of the woman taken in adultery, usually printed at the beginning of John chapter 8. When that woman, in her obvious sin, encountered God in Jesus, she and everyone else would have expected the encounter to result in her being blasted off the face of the earth, an act, that is, of the wrath of God. But amazingly, what happened was that Jesus first shamed the respectable bystanders into not condemning her, and then he told her, "Neither do I condemn you." That is, when she, in her acknowledged sin, had a genuine encounter with God in Jesus, the result was that she was given the opportunity to go and live a new life free from the condemnation of her sin. That was an act of the grace of God, not of his wrath. I think that's a beautiful model of what it is to meet Jesus. We had another model like that a few studies ago in this series when we studied the beginning of Mark chapter 2, the story of the paralysed man let down through the roof. Jesus had there the insight that in this particular man's case, forgiveness of his sins would release even his bodily paralysis. So he announces to him, "Your sins are forgiven." The religious people there then started tutting and saying to each other, "Only God can forgive sins." They were right, of course. Right to spot that there was a problem, and right to identify the problem in the way that they did. The only bit they failed to spot, of course, was that when Jesus forgave the man's sins, it was God forgiving them. That brings us back then to the third member of the coalition, as I listed it, disease. It's this one on which today's reading has rather more information. How does Jesus counter this part of the enemy group? The classical model has people approaching Jesus and exercising their faith in him, while Jesus issues a word of command to the disease. That's the most common pattern in the Gospel stories, and it's one which fits best into our ideas about Jesus. I would regard that as the standard version, as it were, of Jesus ministering healing to people, with any different incidents being seen as variations on that standard. Well, one variation we find is in the passage I've just referred to at the beginning of Mark 2. There's no mention that the paralysed man who was let down through the roof had any faith in Jesus, but there is mention of the faith of the 4 friends who brought him, and it explicitly says that it was on account of their faith that Jesus healed the paralysed man. I like to take that story as a model of our intercession. We exercise our faith in Jesus to bring other people to him, for him to minister to him. We do that in praying for them. That's a valid thing to do, even if the person that we're bringing in prayer doesn't themselves have any faith of their own. It's still a valid thing to bring them to Jesus in prayer. Another variation is the woman with the hemorrhage. She seems to sidestep the need for a word of command from Jesus because she has this powerful conviction that if she just touches his clothes, then she'll be healed. And she is healed. But the story doesn't remain on the touching his clothes level. For a start, Jesus clearly knows that something has taken place in his power encounter with the enemy. For another thing, he clearly has a need to complete his dealings with the woman by letting it be a person-to-person encounter and by giving her a clear assurance that she had been healed, even though the power to heal her had already left him. He saw it as a need to complete it on that person-to-person level. I'm bothered by what unorthodox people can try to make of this story. They could, of course, develop a superstitious or magical view of healing. You've got to find the right thing to touch and then you'll be healed. Usually it's turned out to be a religious relic like a piece of the true cross or a statue of Mary like the one at Lourdes, that sort of thing. Another line they could take is of hyping up their faith, of believing that only if they can have enough faith can the healing be theirs, the power of positive believing, you might say. My view is that if people have approaches like that, which take them too far away from the standard scenario of meeting with Jesus and receiving their healing from him, then they've gone astray, possibly seriously astray, and are up to something different from seeking Christian healing ministry. The standard version is again reinforced in the incident with Jairus' daughter. When the messengers came to tell Jairus of her death, and they advised Jairus not to bother Jesus anymore, Jairus was obviously thrown into turmoil, and Jesus directed him to continue hoping for healing, and he counselled him with the words, "Only believed." Well, you might translate as, "Just trust me. Go on, try it." Our view of the standard version of healing is enhanced also in a backwards way in the visit to Nazareth. Our account of that visit has Jesus almost completely hamstrung by the people's lack of faith. They were trying to contain him within the model of the local boy made good, and they were quite unable to approach him as the one who could transform their lives, quite unable to venture to put their faith in him. And that removed the usual mechanism by which people could reach into people's lives, and it severely reduced the scope of what he was able to do in his own hometown. In a backward way, that reinforces our view that the standard model was for people to approach Jesus, put their faith in him, and for him then to issue a word of command to the disease. So, ranged against the Lord is the powerful enemy coalition, the finite nature of life in this world, the mortal nature of life in this world, the presence of disease, the presence of sin, the work of the devil. In different ways, Jesus encounters this enemy grouping and has his own answer to each problem with which he's presented. Apart from looking at the details of how he deals with each individual challenge, we need also the assurance that his dealing with this enemy is complete. There is nothing that this coalition can come up with which defeats Jesus. The usual Christian preaching about the cross takes the line of proclaiming the completeness of his attack and defence at that point. But a lot earlier in the gospel story, we've already got clear glimpses of how nothing, it seems, can defeat him, whatever part of the coalition the attack's coming from. "Plenteous grace with thee is found, grace to cover all my sin," said Charles Wesley. That's in Jesus, Lover of My Soul, if you've forgotten. Grace to cover all my sin, yes, and all my finiteness, and all my mortality, and all my disease, and all my troubles with the devil into the bargain. Hallelujah. Bless you.